Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are located and in YouTube land out there. This is your Acts 10 guy, and we're doing part three of sermon series on Acts 10, but this is the third part of God's sovereignty and family ministry. So we're going to sort of finish the groundwork. We're going to wrap up the sovereignty issue, wrap up the Gentile issue, wrap up all of this in a tight little bow as best I can, and then move on to some practical application. And we'll probably pick up speed. I'm going to start alluding to other passages in the text going forward because we're going to get there eventually, and we're trucking towards that quickly. So, as usual, bring your Bibles and turn to Acts chapter 10. Verses 1 through 8 is where we're at. We're going to do verses 5 through 8 and then do faith and obedience as a little bit of practical application and then wrap that up as well. So if you're trucking with me, we're going to read the text as usual, go verse 1 through verse 8. So if you're following, I am reading from the King James today. There was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of the band called the Italian man, a devout man and one that feared God with all his house, which gave much alms to the people and prayed to God always. He saw in a vision, evidently about the ninth hour of the day, an angel of God coming into him and saying unto him, Cornelius. And when he looked on him, he was afraid and said, What is it, Lord? And he said unto him, Thy prayers and thy memorials are come up for a memorial. Thy prayers and thy alms are come up for a memorial before God. And that's where we left off. So we're going to start with verse 5 to 8. So let's continue on. Verse 5. And now send men to Joppa, call for one Simon, whose surname is Peter. He lodges with one Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the seaside. He shall tell thee what they ought to do. And when the angel which spoken to Cornelius was departed, he called two of his household servants and a devout soldier of them that waited on him continually. And when he had declared all these things unto them, he sent them to Joppa. Okay, we're stopping at 8 because this is the end of our unpacking. I want to go to another verse because I want to put a nice bow on the Gentile and sovereignty issue, something to think about. So, if you have your Bible out, you can turn to Luke's chapter 2. I'm just going to read one verse, and it's Luke 2, verses 28 through 32. So if you have your Bible out, you can go there. Give you a moment, and I'm going to start reading again. Luke chapter 2, verses 28 through 32. Lord, you are letting your servant depart in peace according to your word, for my eyes have seen your salvation that you have prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for glory to your people Israel. Okay, this is, if you turn there, Simeon was waiting on the Messiah. On a side note for sovereignty and the Gentiles, because I wanted to wrap this up. And it's in conjunction with what I talked about, big picture of why the Peter Cornelius incident was not about race. It was more about sovereignty. And so that's why we're going back to this. Now, Simeon was someone that apparently was waiting on the Messiah, as I said, much like the wise men of the east, more likely from Babylon, that came to give gifts to Herod. They had nailed his date and arrival within a couple years. So it looks like Simeon was praying, fasting, searching the text, seeing the signs, all the things that the wise men were doing, and maybe some additional things as well. And he is rewarded with seeing Jesus' birth. So what's interesting is that the first words out of Simeon's mouth after prepared salvation is that it was in the presence of all peoples, plural, everyone. And then a light for revelation to the Gentiles is first before glory going to Israel. And why'd I say that? Because we're unpacking the sovereignty and the Gentile issue that I talked about that we're going to get to. And I'm trying to get things out of the way to make you understand this is much bigger than just some race thing. Okay. So this God fearing man knew the purpose of the Messiah coming. And providentially, his blessing that he declared in the temple at the time had the Gentiles mentioned before glory to Israel. And the Gentile wise men of the East were studying and knew the Messiah's entry point before the Pharisees even figured it out. And so, big picture sovereignty, that God had declared this in the past. He had predicted salvation was coming. Those that were paying attention were there and were rewarded with seeing it because they were seeing the signs and knew it was coming. Uh, and that included Gentiles. So the idea that there is a bunch of God-fearing people such as Peter, we'll even add Cornelius, Simeon, who we just were introduced to, the wise men of the East, and all of the household of Cornelius, the apostles, that all these men that were God-fearers that were waiting on the Messiah still had this terrible race problem they needed to have checked is absolutely ridiculous. These stories are about sovereignty. That's what they're about. That's what the book's about. That's what Acts is about, compiling all these big ideas and the really big idea of, wow, look what it's going to, not only to the Gentiles, but God is opening up his kingdom in a way that nobody would have saw coming. That's the big idea. So I wanted to wrap that up because when we get to 22, like the second time I've alluded to this, I just want to go into it and we can start to put some of these modern day narratives to rest because frankly, I'm getting tired of them. I'm tired of finding commentaries that find racism under every rock. And that is the main point of particular texts. And as I've plowed through the text and eradicated that out of my vocabulary, I've found that these are minor issues. Sovereignty is the big issue. Okay, beautiful. We got that unpacked. So once we get down the road, hopefully you'll see that it's much bigger and it's much more exciting when you get the little issues out of the way that aren't even issues at all. Amen. All right, so we got to truck through 5 to 8, get a little application. So we're going to start on we're going to go with our word study, which we do a lot here. If you were trucking with us in the first 2 videos, I like to stop and unpack words because I think they're important. Our word in verse 5 is send. Send. It is the same word that it's apostolo, and it's a similar word to the word apostle because the word sent, apostle, is a sent out one, and this is to send forth as a representative and an envoy. So the sending is being done by Cornelius. So it's interesting, it's the same word. So backing up to one of our previous videos about people that claim to be apostles now, look, it's just a sent out one, and the sending out is pointing to Jesus. So if you are exercising that, you're being sent out to a church to point to Jesus coming back and splitting the sky because that's the next event on the calendar. So again, beware of people that are trying to be apostles and want to go back to the Acts 2 church. They just want to be superstars without the martyrdom. They don't want to die at all. So this is the word that is used in verse 5. In verse 5, just to reiterate again, is now send official representatives and delegates, men to Joppa in verse 5, and call for one Simon, whose surname is Peter. Okay, so I wanted to unpack that word send because it is the same word as sent out ones, aka Peter. So the sent out envoy from Cornelius is going to the sent out one Peter, who's about to get a vision as well about this group of people that is sent to see him. So very, very interesting. Kind of funny. The same word, probably not a coincidence at all. So let's move on to verse 6. And he lodged with one Simon, who's by the seaside. He shall tell thee what they ought to do. One more thing to unpack here in verse 6 about our details. We went over Simon the tanner and the unique aspect of that trade, that where he had to be located on the east side of town, according to the Mishnah. and that it was going to be smelly and they weren't well thought of. We unpacked that. One more point that makes this detail oriented. Remember, we talked about sovereignty and the details very intricate, showing that God cares as well. That this particular one was by the seaside. Well, the reason that's important, remember, I thought it had to be on the east side according to the Mishnah. This part was so unique that there's no way that the it could have been adjacent to the seaside, meaning on the sea, not just on the east side of a seafaring town. This one had to be on the sea, which means it was probably the only one not on the east side, because the east side, it was the west side of the town was the sea. So it had to be on the west side. So it was further tailored to be totally unique. This was probably the only one that existed at this specific location. Another really cool detail about God's sovereignty, how detailed it is. Amen. Amen. When we get to verse 7, or as we're trucking along here, he tells, actually, let's stay in verse 6. The word ought, because in the King James it says, and he, Peter, is going to tell Cornelius what he ought to do. Okay. That word is mentioned Matthew 23:23, 25:27, 24:26, 15:1, and James 3:10. And those words are really imperative, important, crucial statements. It doesn't happen very often. The word ought here is the connotation that this is vital. So it's well, getting Cornelius 100% in tune with what is about to be said by Peter is absolutely essential knowledge. And he's already illustrated how important that is and he's going to, well, Cornelius is going to illustrate how important that is and how well he understands how vital the information is and how important this all is, how every detail matters, how the sovereignty matters. Because he knows I'm going to be told what I ought to do, what is very and vital for the salvation of myself and others. Okay? So Cornelius's response to this ought to do in verse 7 is in verse 8, it says, and when he had declared all these things unto them, he sent them to Joppa. Well, Cornelius is now sending out representatives, as we talked about, an envoy, official apostles, apostle types sent out, ones from his most trusted confidants. And the word explained here is a Greek word. I don't talk about Greek words a lot because I don't want to sound super smart. Sometimes people overdo that. But this one's important because it's the Greek word where we get our English word exegesis, which is to expound upon the text verse by verse, so to speak, like I'm doing here. So that explanation, it's to give a detailed report. So Cornelius is hearing what he ought to do, and he is responding by methodically giving his detailed, particular instructions as to if this is what I ought to do. Now, you have a responsibility as one of my trusted servants to make sure you communicate without one iota difference what I need you to say to this man, Peter, who's going to tell us what we have to do. So the attention to detail that God's showing big, and the attention to detail that Cornelius is responding with, is giving you the solemn understanding that this is a serious, serious event. It's so serious that I'll allude to the text we're going to, that at the same time they were praying, we find out in some of the next chapters coming up that we'll get to, that Peter is receiving a vision that is going to explain why Cornelius is sending 3 men. So every detail is unpacked. This is why this is so huge and so important. Okay? Now, this is the fun stuff. From here on out, you've got right now about, I'd say, hour and a half of prep work. And from here back to the first 2 videos that you can go back and check out. to make sure you're trucking down the line, get your dates right, get your uh, exegesis right, so to speak, get all your terms right, review all that. So now we're going to get into all the application. And the first are probably the applications that come right out of the text in this particular incident between Cornelius and Peter are probably the two most important because they're dealing with faith and obedience. So that's why we got to fast forward to Peter a little bit too, because when Peter hears in the vision is clarifying these sovereignty issues of who is clean, unclean, and how clean God makes them, really, because he's about to explain that they're that there's men that are coming over, and you're about to embark on something that you've never seen before. This is going to stun you, so to speak. And notice that Peter is just as obedient as Cornelius. When Peter gets his vision and the men are at the door, he leaves without doubting. He brings people with him. He doesn't know what's coming any more than Cornelius does. So you need to understand the context that both these men are operating at a high level of faith and obedience. And this is so important because faith and obedience is the doctrine, so to speak. So I want to get into some big picture stuff about doctrine and then faith and obedience, and then we'll wrap this up eventually. We'll be trucking on down the road to the next section of scripture, but I want to camp out on faith and obedience before we close, which is a little bit of time we're going to spend on this. My two verses I'm going to use, one has to do with doctrine and the other as faith, is John 7:17. And Jesus is teaching in front of the Pharisees, and they're not listening, which is normal. And so I'm just pulling an excerpt out of this particular exchange. And it says, if any man will do his will, he shall know of the doctrine, whether it be of God and whether I speak of myself. So here's the other verse we're going to use, and then I'll go to where I'm going with this. Hebrews 11:6. For those of you who don't know, Hebrews 11 is like it's called the Hall of Fame. It talks about the faith of Enoch, Abraham, and everybody. The whole chapter is a who's who of faith. It is the faith chapter. The definition of faith is in verse 1. Okay, so we're not going to unpack all of that because this is an introduction to the concepts. We're going to get more about faith and obedience probably throughout this whole series we're doing here on Acts 10 and as we truck on down the road. So we're not going to unpack everything today. We'll just probably get back to it and layer it, give you a little more, little more, little more. So we're going to start with introduction. All right. So your definition of faith is in this chapter. It's in verse 1. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Okay. So Hebrews 11:6. But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. Okay? So, why is this about faith? Well, the first part's obvious. Neither Cornelius nor Peter were given the outcome. Neither Cornelius nor Peter had any idea what was really coming. Cornelius was told by an angel, somebody's going to tell you what you ought to do. What that is, he didn't know. Peter didn't even know he was leaving until the men showed up. So Peter is really just going, Peter's responding because God told him, doubt nothing. So Peter's going on command. He's told to doubt nothing, so I just have to leave. So both of these guys are operating, like I said earlier, in prime faith and obedience. And the first component of it is you are not told why. Can I give you the faith doctrine? I'm not saying this text in 717 is alluding to just this, but you know one of the faith doctrines? Some people are really going to not like this, but it's predestination. It's the idea that God said that he ordained salvation before the foundation of the world. And the doctrine is that by faith, he gives man free will, and you apply this by faith. So how can you have a God that preordains salvation and you apply it by faith? How does that make sense? Well, that's the faith doctrine. Can I tell you the proper Christian response to that question of how you reconcile the two? It's 7 words with a period at the end of it. I don't know, but I believe it, period. And you put it on the shelf and move on. That's why it's the faith doctrine. On a side note, you want to find every false teacher? They hate predestination. They also hate revelation. They'll do everything in the world to ignore it. They'll tell you doctrine divides. They'll dance around it like nobody's business because ultimately they are not a child that appreciates God's salvation and His sovereignty. They don't want to hear it. So, one of the doctrines is predestination because you have to take it by faith. As a matter of fact, the moment that you try to explain it away, it is now no longer faith. You have to simply put your 7 words, put a period on it, and move on. You actually don't have a choice. So the second part of this is the application. So this is John 7:17 and Hebrews 11:6. Just like Peter and Cornelius both ish doing this, this is faith and works in action. Neither man to start off with is told the end result, just like predestination. You're told what revelation is going to be, but you're told to have faith. Because Christians, we're not given whether we're going to have a good life or not on this planet. We're not. We don't get that. You have to take the promises by faith, and you have to be diligent theologically towards the rest in Hebrews, meaning it's the end of days when Jesus splits the sky. So what does our text in Hebrews 11:6 tell us? Why is it impossible? Why is it without faith, it is impossible to please him. You ever stop and think, why is that impossible? Well, they're about to answer it for you. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, even though he can't see him. And he is a rewarder to them that diligently seek him. The key word is diligently. You know how long diligently is? You don't know. 5, 10, 20, 40, 50 years, lifetime? The answer is you don't know. By faith, you believe that eternity is your reward. And that there are things like you looking in the background, it obviously means I live in a peaceful place. So is that good? Is that a reward for doing some along the way? Yeah. Am I guaranteed this? Was I guaranteed this? Am I guaranteed more than that? The answer is no. So faith and obedience are the doctrine. That's why James can say faith without works is dead. We see it here. If both parties did not go, there's no story here. Both parties did not know the end of the matter, and both parties went anyway. Faith and obedience. And the doctrine, as Jesus is illustrating, is, like I said, I say predestination, and I don't want to say that it's the only one, but I've yet to find a false teacher that wants anything to do with it. Because you have to take it by faith. You don't have an option. You can't reconcile it. Just like you can't have the roadmap of exactly how your life is going to look in detail uh, between your walk and being rewarded eternally. You don't get that. So faith is the doctrine. So, and we see it on display here. We'll get into later that some of the false doctrines are to take away from faith and the coming kingdom to variety of things that are new gospels. They won't tell you that, but they are. The race thing is one of them. Well, us all coming together as one common kumbaya, one world moment is another one. Reconciling us to each other is another version of the same false gospel. It's a new good news, and it doesn't trust Jesus' sovereignty. Sovereignty, predestination, and the book of Revelation are the three things that people that don't like the Bible, they're never going to get on board with. And if you understand that, then you can zero in on what's important and what's not. Faith, obedience, and the doctrine. They're important because they tell on people and they tell you, they give you comfort if you're the pilgrim walking down the long road, sometimes lonely road. You need some assurances, and obviously you're not going to get them from worldly things because you're not seeking that. So you're going to have to find them in spiritual ways, other people that are on the same road with you. For me, being able to have a peaceful place to do a video like this says, okay, I got some assurance along the way. It's nice to have a house, and you know, because there's people that don't. Those people that don't, what kind of assurance they have? Well, they have some along the way, and ultimately, it's our blessed hope that's coming in Revelation. And we believe that because we believe the sovereignty of all the things that happened before the New Testament, and the culmination of Revelation, sovereignty. And we believe God is sovereign, therefore He predestined things because we don't. The easy part that you can't understand is if both these men, Peter and Cornelius, both had the same great attributes on why faith and obedience are important is they understand that neither of them want salvation to have anything to do with them. Because the whole idea of someone, God being greater than you, means you want him to be greater than you because salvation involving you is a bad deal. Number one, you probably don't want salvation for anybody other than you. Number two, you don't want to be the one in charge of being sovereign because of your selfish nature. The people that understand the Bible know that this issue of bowing down to God is easy. You've had enough mirror time. Marriage is, this is why we do this is church, channels about family ministry, because marriage is the crucible that tells on you anyway. If you've been with the same woman or man for 20 years, you're going to find out how bad you really are. You're going to have to rely on Jesus. It is the crucible. Your children tell on you. It tells you everything you don't want to know before it tells you what you do want to know. Therefore, faith and obedience is absolutely essential because it doesn't start off with someone making a video that you may think makes sense in front of some nice bookshelves in a house. It's not how it starts. Matter of fact, you probably don't want to know how it starts. It starts a lot worse than that. And you, without faith in believing, you don't have any hope that you're going to get to there, get to here. You you wouldn't even keep going down the road without faith. Okay. So, theologically speaking, just to break down this, faith really is most theological circles that are conservative, Baptist, so to speak, we view faith as a gift from God. This is where our predestination and works, and where other people want to wrestle with this, and it's not a problem for us. Yes, it's a gift, and yes, we exercise it, but everything comes from Christ. So the gift of faith is it's the idea that we if He didn't provide this something to us, then we wouldn't exercise anything anyway. And that's what baffles everybody that is a non-believer. They don't understand it. The best way I can describe it to you is the idea of a rickety old bridge. And I've had rickety old bridge experiences in my life. And I'll briefly tell you about the last one, and then we'll close with a nice testimony. I was at what I call my home church, and I was wrestling with some decisions in my life. And at the time, I was thinking about quitting a job, and I eventually did. I'm going to try to give you the shortened version of the story. But circumstances happened to teach me something about faith and the rickety old bridge. I'll tell you what I mean by that. There was a pastor of mine that was counseling me on whether I was called to preach, things of that nature. And one thing I remember is he said to me, Derek, when this is all, once you make your decision, number one, I can't make it for you, but when you do it, you're going up there. I don't know how he did that. Look, it's the idea that you can't make you, that gate of you walking through is narrow. It's really for you, and you do get your family if you've made yourself a unit, but not much more than that. So your decision to come to Christ has to be you. So I learned this big time in this moment because I learned that whatever decision I made about this job, I really couldn't ask anybody's opinion. If you're grown up, you're taking counsel from somebody, but even their advice, if they're godly, is I can't make decisions for you anyway either. So you're stuck with making a call that you're not comfortable with. So let me tell you what happened. I decided I want to start a handyman business. The reason is number one, I thought I could provide more than the job. And number two, I felt like I needed skills that were outside of the skills that I currently had. And I was somewhat good at carpentry. I liked it, but I really felt like I needed to get better at it. And the only way to do it was to dive in. So I thought I had some tile work lined up with this guy and some other work lined up. So I told my job I was leaving, but the tile work said, we really need you to show up now. So I went into my job and I told them that I'm leaving and I may not be able to give a notice. I remember my boss just said, Derek, if it's any good, they'll wait. And we talked for a little bit and he said, I'll tell you what, you got to go to work tomorrow, right? I said, yeah. He said, you come in and you give me your decision. You know, if you don't, if you, if you leave without the 2 weeks notice, we can't bring you back. And I'd had a good relationship there. I'd worked there a couple of years. You know, I worked my way up. I made a little bit more money than when I started. They liked me. It wasn't a bad job. But I remember feeling compelled that I had to do it now. I wasn't sure why. So I did. I said, and I told him that. I told him, I feel like this is a faith decision. I don't really know, but I really think I have to. And he wished me luck and said, well, I hope you do well. So I essentially did the biblical right version of burning a bridge. You notice how it worked out, though, or that burning a bridge is played out as, you say, I take this job and shove it, I ain't working here no more. That paints the picture that you don't want to do that, which you don't, but you are called to burn bridges, but you do it the right way. It means you're going to have to face people. And that's what I did. You're going to have to explain your decisions. So here's where the bridge burning was important. And the bridge burning was I had to not give my 2 weeks notice. Do you know why? That within a week, I walked out into nothing. As it turns out, the person that promised some tile work was lying through their teeth, and so was the other person. And the last job that I did, while I was doing a little of both, I didn't even get paid for it. I stepped out into nothing, which meant as scared as I was to make the decision, I'd have probably ran across that bridge to go back if I could have. And what God revealed to me is, I'm just giving you faith. You realize how scared you are? And without what I've given you, you notice that if it wasn't like he was audibly talking to me, I'm working this out in my head for you, but I was noticing that if I would have given it 2 weeks notice, there's no way, as scared as I was to walk across to quit, I would have ran back. And you think, well, why? And it taught me that, number one, faith and works together. That I did it. I did what you're not supposed to do, but I really couldn't. And if the circumstances weren't aligned by God, I'd have went back. Let me tell you the end of the story. The house we're living in right now, I'm not going to tell you how much we got it for. We got it for a pretty good deal because I knew how to renovate things. All the skills that I had acquired since then, I don't even want to tell you how much money they saved us in terms of this house, but it turned out to be the right decision. And I never would have did it if I didn't tell them I have to leave now. Because if I'd have had the security of going back, I would have went back, and that would have been the wrong decision. It taught me that faith is something that God gives you. And it's more of, I want to give you something for your journey. The, crossing the bridge and doing and then burning it, saying, I'm not going back, wasn't to prove something to God. It was God to give something to me. That's the best I can explain to you, that faith and works don't contradict in themselves, and predestination and free will are not problems. But faith and obedience are the two most important. And to end, we see it on display with these two men, Cornelius and Peter. Both of them deserve the highest of praise for exercising faith and obedience, far better than my piddly little story. These men didn't even need nothing. They didn't even think like I thought. They weren't thinking to go back. They just heard and they're rolling in this direction. So we need to praise a great story of two men, of both Peter and Cornelius, not just one. Okay. All right. I hope you're blessed by what we went through today, and we're going to get more application and stories as we go. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. We're going to do less nuts and bolts and more testimonies and more application going into other texts. And so that should be a little bit more enjoyable, but don't forget your foundation. If you get confused, go back and get your dates. You need to have everything unpacked. Review the first two and a half, really, because about midstream I switched to sermon mode a little bit and off of nuts and bolts. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed it. As always on this channel, you be of good courage, you be of good cheer. I hope I said something to stimulate thought and hit your heart. And until next time, God bless.